So tonight we're looking at, as I say, chapters 21 to 30 of Margery's book. And the second part of this, it's only the last 5 chapters that really look at Margery's pilgrimage to the Holy Land. But I thought this would be quite a good opportunity to talk about her journeys, her pilgrimages within the text, because they really are very interesting. The pilgrimage that we have been looking at the last few days is the pilgrimage to the Holy Land. It actually makes up the longest of the pilgrimages. The other two are to Compostela in Germany. And we have to link in, as you know, because the bit we've read tonight is just going to the Holy Land, but then she stops off at Rome on her way home. Now, the reason why I want to look at this is that actually not very long after this, Margery is going to be accused in her heresy trial of fabricating that she went on her pilgrimage to Jerusalem and the holy sites. So I thought it'd be quite interesting this evening to actually ask ourselves, well, is this true? Did she fabricate going to the Holy Land? Well, it's really hard to tell this on the first reading, as actually she tells us very little about the places that she visits. So it's really hard to be able to get some kind of external evidence to show that she actually went to the sites. The reason for this is that Margery is not particularly, she's not particularly worried about actually telling us about these religious sites, this pilgrimage. What she's more important for her is actually telling us about what happened within her religious life in these places. She doesn't want to document a trip to the Holy Land as we would today with travel literature or something like that. So that's not the most important part of her writing of this stage of her life. But what is important is actually what happens to her. So the only way we can actually begin to think, well, did Margery actually go there? And is this expressed in her text? Is if we begin to construct what Margery would have experienced, not from what she writes, but what from other people writes. Right. So there are 2 people who did actually travel to the Holy Land around this sort of time, just a little bit later than Margery. And they write in similar terms, but they do give us a little bit more information. Now, the first one is a chap called William Way, and he went to the Holy Land in 1458 and then again in 1462. So as I say, just a little bit later, but around that 15th century period. And the other one is a Dominican friar called Felix Fabric. And he's Swiss, and he went to the Holy Land in 1480 and then again 1483. So neither of them give us enormous travel logs that we would hope. But what they do give us is some essential details that really begin to ring true with Margery's experience. So if we look at the 2 of these writers first, the first one is William Way. So William Way, he was one of the first fellows of Eton College, which was founded by King Henry VI in 1442. And he was given special dispensation from the king to absent himself from his duties at Eton College to go on a pilgrimage. Now, once again, he says very little about his route from England to Venice. It's kind of a bit of a fast forward to Venice. But instead, what he does give is he gives us a bit, quite a lot of useful information about what we're going to need to do to prepare for the trip. So, for example, he tells us about the different exchange rates and how you have to get your money changed. Otherwise, you won't be able to use the English money in these different countries. It sounds a bit obvious, really, to us today, but I guess for pilgrims going over, they needed all these kind of instructions and ideas. And then he also says something which probably, hopefully, will ring true with what you've been reading about Margery, is that he gives very clear instructions on what provisions the pilgrim will need to buy when they're in Venice. So, for example, they'll need to buy their own bedding, and then when they finish their trip, they'll have to give that bedding up, they'll have to sell it. He also gives a really helpful account of the different sites that people invariably went to on their pilgrimage in the Holy Land. So the kind of standard tour. And this includes Jaffa, Ramla, Lydda, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Mount Judea, and then Jerusalem. And then you go to the River Jordan and Bethany, then you come back to Jerusalem by Ramla. He gives a very brief description of each of these places, which is mainly factual. Unfortunately, we don't have that beautiful kind of, as we do today, description of what people encountered and what the landscape looked like. It's actually very brief. And then what follows is actually his narrative. But again, this is quite short, and it's short on descriptive detail, which is a little bit annoying because it'd be really nice to have a real, description of what it was like passing through these countries at this time. But what it does tell us is that Margery then is writing in a style of journey writing, which was not unfamiliar at the time. The brief, but only factual details. So this was the kind of writing that people did around the middle of the 15th century. So Margery's not doing anything unusual by just giving us certain parts and actually leaving out quite a lot of the details. What is important is the way his writing, though, throws light on some of the details that Margery gives about her journey. There are two really good ones. First of all, we deduce that it was really normal to embark from Venice. Margery talks about going from Venice, so does William Way. And you notice when Margery's in Venice, she spends 13 weeks in Venice, which seems rather a long time. 13 weeks, that's quite a long time. But it's probably because when she's there, she needs to get all her provisions sorted out. She needs to get all her bedding. And more importantly, she needs to engage or hire a ship to take her down. So that actually could take quite a long time. And the time when most pilgrims would travel down to Jerusalem would be in that kind of between spring and summer, so spring and high summer, so between April and August. So it may be that during this period, it was really quite difficult to get hold of a ship. And actually, Margery mentions that the group that she's traveling with is hiring a ship and then buying all the bedding that was necessary. So that really rings true with that travel document that William Way is talking about. It rings true. Now, if you remember, when she's in Venice, she doesn't have a good time with her fellow pilgrims. She doesn't seem to have a very good time with them at all the way through. And God warns her that she needs to take another galley or another ship. But what she has to do, there's a real interesting bit of detail then, is she has to sell the barrels of wine that she's bought or she's paid for to actually be able to get this other ship. And it's interesting how her fellow companions all think, oh, Margery must know something that we don't. And then they all jump ship and come and follow with her. That's kind of a sweet little aside, isn't it, for Margery, showing that actually she is quite trusted in her advice and in her judgment. So this ties in very much with the need to buy provisions, and also it's another bit of evidence that shows us that Margery really had quite a lot of her own financial means. She not only, before she goes off to Jerusalem, she not only pays off all her debts, but all her husband's debts as well. So this is a lady who isn't reliant on her husband. We're not talking about the Victorian period where all your property and all your money became owned by a husband. Margery is still keeping ownership of her own money and her own and what she can do with it, which is quite an interesting concept. It's not what we often think about of medieval women. So we know that she's the one who's actually probably paying for all these provisions. And hence it may be that's why the other fellow pilgrims say, well, we're going to go with her because she's got the money. So then we're also told about Wei's tour, exactly the route he took, or the itinerary that any standard pilgrim would take. And it seems to very much ring true with the sense of movement of Margery that we get in her text over the 3 weeks, i.e. when she refers to a trip to the River Jordan and passing on her way back to Ramla, to Jerusalem, it's exactly the route that Wei speaks about in his itinerary. So, and that's another bit of evidence that shows that what she's talking about is actually what other people are talking about when they talk about pilgrimage in Jerusalem. There's another detail that Margery gives us, which is also echoed within William's Way tour, and that is about the arduous climb up Mount Pontrytime. Now, if you remember, she gets very exhausted and she's abandoned by her fellow pilgrims, and instead a handsome Saracen helps her out. And he helps her up to the top of the mountain, which she says is a very arduous climb. And the same detail is given to us by William Way, who also describes the difficulty of the climb up this particular mountain. He writes, "It was passing hot and right high, and so he advises pilgrims that when they come to the bottom of it, they need to rest and have some food and drink." So it's not like Margery is making this up at all. She's actually explaining to us an experience that she had when she was in the Holy Land. So again, we have more evidence to show that actually she was there and that she experienced the same things that William Way points out on his standard tour of the Holy Land. Another comment by Way also throws light on Margery's odd description of Christ's crucified body, which she beholds in contemplation on Mount Calvary. Now, if you remember, she goes into it quite a lot, what this vision looks like, but the standout term is that she describes Jesus as full of wounds than ever a dove house was of holes. It's sort of, woof, Where has that come from? Well, it's interesting that on one level, she's talking about an image from the Song of Songs. That's where it's kind of based on. But also, it's mentioned in many devotional texts at the time. It's mentioned in the Ancre Visa. It's mentioned in writings by St. Bernard. So it was a widely used metaphor to actually express Jesus being full of wounds. But what Way's account suggests is that this wasn't something that was just plucked out of the air, but actually had an underlying source that was linked to pilgrimage in the Holy Land. So Calvary at that time was a 15-foot mound, and it was enclosed within the same building which housed the Chapel of the Holy Sepulchre. Now, what was distinctive about this was the round roof at the time, and it was made to look like a dovecot, and it was covered in lead, and Way describes it in sense using the terms of being a dovecot. Now, possibly this dovecot analogy was also being made to pilgrims by the Franciscan guides. So there it is in all the kind of devotional writing, but also the Franciscans who looked after these holy sites were then explaining and linking up this imagery to the actual place. And Margery says to us that friars always, as they went about, told them what our Lord suffered in every place. So there's a kind of linking up of imagery in devotional writing, imagery in scripture, and what the actual place looked like. And all of that is being expressed by William Way and also by Margery. Other pilgrimage accounts help us also to see that the very few details given by Margery are probably not random, but actually represent the most memorable highlights of her trip. So just taking this source, it seems highly likely that Margery had actually been there. So if we look at the other source, which is Felix Fabri, who was a Dominican friar, here we get something like a modern travelogue. And what's wonderful about his text is that we really get his personality comes through. He really explains to us the place, but what he thinks about it, it's his personal experience and also his personal opinions as well. So what he's really helpful about is how humorous and colourful his records are of this experience. And it's not just the Holy Land, it's also the entire Middle East. And he explains it to his fellow pilgrims in terms of behavior as he entered the Holy Sepulchre. So he goes into that detail of observing other people. And what's really noticeable is this moment when people enter the Holy Sepulchre, pilgrims enter the sepulchre, and he describes them as their outburst of emotion. What he says is that they flung themselves down and they kissed the earth many times. And he also describes that there would have been abundance of tears, bitter and heartfelt groans. There were sighs and laments and sobs that even a heart of stone would have burst into tears. He also says that some fell down as if they were dead, and others knelt with outstretched arms, and others wandered around beating their breast. And even more, He says that others were shaken with violent sobs that they could not stand. Now, immediately, this is resonating with what the description we have of Margery when she goes into these, particularly the Holy Sepulchre, but all round Jerusalem. And Felix also draws attention to the shrieks of women. So when we read Margery's text, it seems very much that Margery is the only one who is actually having these sort of extreme emotional outbursts. But what Felix shows us is that she wasn't, that this was the expression of piety and faith by many of the pilgrims who went to the Holy Land. So Margery was just doing what others would have done. But what's important about this is that Margery describes this as the first great crying, which happened in Jerusalem. And what happens, of course, is that when she gets home, it doesn't stop. Now, that's the bit that's unusual. So it may have been that she starts this cry because she sees those people around her doing something similar, or she joins in with their expression of piety and devotion. Now, of course, today we might call this behavior as mass hysteria, but it also could have been something that was culturally conditioned. At the time, what was really important was the narrative of the Passion and the scriptural description of Jesus on the cross. Now, as we know, that description in the Bible is very brief. But through imaginative engagement with scripture, the devout were encouraged to use their imagination to place themselves at the foot of the cross with those who love Jesus. And what was important about placing yourself at the foot of the cross was actually to experience that compassion, that feeling of agony and sadness and sorrow for Jesus who is dying on the cross before you. And it was seen as not only echoing the love and devotion of Mary, but also it was seen as a kind of penitential devotional road back to a deeper relationship with God. So it was seen as part of your devotional exercises to actually weep and lament before the cross. Mary is the icon of this. And of course, at the time, she was seen as the icon for the perfect response to the love of Christ on the cross. She is often described in these terms. She waxes out of her mind. She swooned. She pined. She waxed half dead. So again, these are the images, the response to the cross that we're seeing modeled by those pilgrims in the Holy Sepulchre. So Margery, like other pilgrims, may have been influenced by such descriptions to actually have a similar outflowing of emotions when they are in the actual spaces where this happened. So if you think about it, also, it's not just Margery who does this. Julian of Norwich also has a similar desire to stand at the foot of the cross and know for herself the sorrow and agony of seeing Christ, to seeing Christ die and suffer. So it was a very common devotional trope at the time. Now, Felix tells us that not all pilgrims were like this, and that actually there were some who laughed at the other pilgrims' behavior, and they called them fools, hypocrites, vainglorious, deceivers, and brain sick. It's a very similar list of insults that Margery has when she equally shows such emotional expression. Felix's account also explains why there seems to be no astonishment on the part of Margery's fellow Christians when she falls to the ground and starts roaring in Jerusalem. There's not really much surprise, because that seems to be the normal kind of response for those people who are particularly devout in their engagement and experience of the places, the holy places of the Holy Land. But what does surprise people, and this also goes back to what I said, is that this continues for many years after Margery returns home. So it's not a contained experience, it continues. So it's sort of like she's been given the gift of this compassion and empathy with Mary and those who stand at the foot of the cross, but it continues into her ordinary life at home. Margery's scribe, I think if you remember at one point, Margery's scribe sort of interjects into the narrative of the book and tells us that actually, you know, Margery's outpouring of grief is echoed within ordinary life itself. Or if you lose a dear friend, or if you lose a relative, or if you lose your business, then actually you have a similar kind of outpouring of grief and sadness and emotional agony. It's interesting that he says that, because it seems as well to be a kind of justification or even an explanation of why Margery is continuing this, and sort of saying, is it really surprising that we all experience this emotional outpouring at times in our life? And why do we judge Margery so harshly for it? It seems to be what the scribe is saying and defending Margery in her, what to others could seem rather a ridiculous way of behaving. So in conclusion, even though Margery's account of going to the Holy Land seems to be very flat and quite sparse, when we compare it with these two external authorities on writing on the Holy Land, it does seem to stand up pretty well. And Margery's pilgrimage reflects what would be seen as standard practice in going to the Holy Land. The details she gives us are also, we have seen, are not random, but they're kind of the high points of her pilgrimage. Now, if you think, if Margery is writing this many, many years later, then if you look back on a holiday that you took about 20 years ago, then actually you don't remember all the details. You remember the high points. You remember the significant stories. They can be really good stories, and they can be really bad stories. I always say to my family, if something horrendous goes wrong in a holiday, it was, so, well, don't worry, we've got something to talk about for the next few years. And I think that's similar, is that Margery's looking back and she's saying, oh yeah, oh, and this happened, I remember that. So I think that explains why we don't have this incredible sort of travel log, which it would be wonderful if we had. And we've also seen that her conduct is actually not as extreme as it first appears to us, that actually it is in relation to other pilgrims at the time. So I'd like to argue that Margery certainly did go on pilgrimage to the Holy Land, and that those who accuse her of not going are basically wrong. And that her book, in stating this really briefly, is not underplaying it, but it's actually trying to get through the narrative. I can imagine Margery with this scribe just going on and talking about this and talking about that. And the scribe is trying to not write, you know, a 20 volume work, but trying to get it down into one volume. And so really condensing her narrative into something quite short, but also that is very comparable of the time, getting the details in, not the long preamble. Because what's important about this is not so much what the adventures that she had, but it's actually the inner development that happened. And there are two real important inner developments. The first is what we've seen in this section, the 2025 through to 30, and that is this kind of screaming, spontaneous weeping and sobbing and the flaying around in prayer and in weeping. But also what's significant about that is that it's very much seen as a gift from God, that she's not in control of when this happens, that it's a spontaneous gift that God gives her. And the other thing is her spiritual marriage to the Godhead. And that's what we're going to see in the next few chapters when she heads into Rome. So that's just a little bit of an introduction to pilgrimage in medieval times, slightly different from Chaucer's pilgrims down to Canterbury. But I always like to remind people that when Chaucer was writing his pilgrims to Canterbury, he's not actually trying to describe a real pilgrimage. He's using the idea of pilgrimage as a scaffolding in which to tell stories and in which to have this wonderful interplay between the teller and what they tell. So we have to just remember that Chaucer is actually a literary device. He's not trying to describe a real pilgrimage, whereas Margery is giving the highlights of her pilgrimage. So there we are. I'm going to now share my screen with you so that you can see the questions that I have for you tonight to ponder. As I always say every week, please, please, please do use these as a basis for your pondering and your conversation, but don't feel that you have to exactly follow them if you have something else that you want to talk about.